This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy, with University of Illinois being at the forefront of adopting the new and improved, in quotation marks, adversity SAT. Let's talk a little bit about higher education. A piece by economics professor at George Mason University, John VC Nye, Reason Magazine, reason.com. Those who are less academically qualified should not, because of some essay they wrote for a specialized pool of admissions officers, buoyed by a donation from their parents, be granted to a top school over a middle or lower class child so naive as to think that strong test scores and grades would be enough. Outside the United States, such a system would be rightly filed under corruption and malfeasance, with or without the addition of phony claims to athletic prowess. That's the admissions scandal, but is the admissions scandal just an opportunity for us to get past talking about Lori Loughlin's YouTube influencer daughter and on to more structural problems with college admissions, in addition to what's actually happening on college campuses when it comes to scholarship and the assignment of grades? For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by the aforesaid professor, John Nye, professor of economic history and new institutional economics at George Mason University, and the holder of the Frederick Bastiat Chair in Political Economy at the Mercatus Center. Professor, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So one of the points that you make, in addition to that passage that I read from your piece, you started out by really focusing on grade inflation and why that is so damaging to the quality of the students that are coming out of our universities and scholarship generally. Why don't you develop that a bit?
Well, I mean, the simple thing is, why do we have grades? Grades are there to give information to the student and to the professor about what they've learned. Grade inflation basically damages that. Moreover, you not only do not know correctly who is doing well and who is not, but you are not able to properly rank people. As I've said before, if you simply remove all grades, imagine if every single course were not even pass-fail. There's just no grades. What kind of information would we have? What feedback would we have about who's done well and who's not? Grade inflation is just a slightly improved version of not giving any grades at all. Even worse, grade inflation that differs across fields. For example, if engineering is much tougher than, say, another subject, then that happens. It means that the grades mean different things depending upon what subject you take.
And you write that average GPAs have risen by a full point or more, depending on the discipline, since the late 60s. And so how does that translate into sort of the signaling that is provided the outside world with respect to college graduates they're looking to possibly employ?
Well, it used to mean a lot more to say someone was a college graduate to begin with, regardless of which college they went to, because it was simply harder to graduate from college. I mean, that's just the truth. More people get into more colleges today, and yet I would argue that the standard of, if you like, the worst college graduate, which is what I love to measure, seems to be much lower than it was before. And that's just in terms of ability to write well, to make an argument clearly, and to do certain types of college-level math. Those things have declined. But what's worse, even elite colleges have changed the requirements. Most elite colleges, 60, 70, 100 years ago, used to have core curricula. There were courses everyone had to take. For the most part, that's gone by the wayside. Even most so-called core curricula give you a menu. You have a choice of classes. And this means that it's very hard to compare people even at the same university.
Well, what do you think, too? But there's a lot of discretion between professors. Say if you have to write an essay, I mean, that's always hard to, determine who should get an A, who should get a B, who should get a C, because a different professor with the same rhetoric might give them a different grade.
Absolutely. And that has always been a problem. But all this doesn't change that problem. It makes it much worse. Because the problem is that, for example, it's well known that the humanities have higher average grades than the engineering, physics, math, and technical subjects with a lot of math, like a lot of economics classes and a lot of technical subjects. So that is just well known. This has been well studied at places like University of Michigan or Wisconsin or places like that. So one of the things that does is think about the problem. The problem is the following. Imagine that you're a pretty good student, and in the old days, you would have gotten a respectable C in a very tough engineering program. But on the other hand, let's say you would get an A in a subject, rather than insult anyone, let's just call it the easy A subject, an easy A major, where everyone gets an A just for showing up and breathing. The problem you get is that if employers know it's an easy A subject, the A doesn't mean very much. The problem, however, is not just the A. The problem is the C still means something, and so employers don't take that into account. There are a lot of jobs where they say, well, you've got to have the B average to get this job. Well, if you have a C average from a really tough engineering program, you're out of luck. If you have an A average, it doesn't help you much, but it doesn't hurt you either. So that tends to push people out of the demanding subjects into the easier ones.
Well, sure.
So it not only hurts the signal, it hurts those who want to get into tougher areas.
Sure, and the grade inflation going on in colleges is just sort of a version of the grade inflation that colleges are being provided themselves when it comes to the coveted rankings and so forth. You make the point that college rankings penalize schools with lower graduation rates that are tougher, more rigorous, thus lower graduation rates. So the system harms the more rigorous schools, suggesting that they're not as good. It's sort of upside down, but that's sort of grade inflation for the colleges themselves, and then they just pass that down the line.
Correct. Moreover, as I've emphasized, the people most hurt are the hardworking, poorer kids who have no other signals to give. A rich kid who otherwise would still do well in the world, even if he or she got C's or D's in their classes, because they have other connections that help them through. They're not as harmed by it. In fact, they're helped by it because they can look good. In contrast, the poor kid who doesn't expend expensive extracurriculars so he or she can fly to India or South America to do work, he or she has nothing except grades to show from it, how are you going to show you're any good?
Yeah, and well, sure. And also the perverse incentives. And you give this example of the California Institute of Technology, Caltech, and the engineering students that shying away from Caltech to go to schools that have sort of the same prestige but are easier, because why risk doing something that's more challenging to me when I can get the prestige I'm looking for going somewhere else that engages in grade inflation and other sort of path of least resistance policies?
I can tell you an even more specific story. I had a schoolmate, I won't even mention names, but I had a schoolmate who worked for Nobel Prize winners in medicine, had top MCAT scores, medical school, but because she was at Caltech, she had something like a B- average, which is sort of above the average of people coming in or something in that time. She was rejected, I think, by something like 29 out of 30 med schools she applied to.
I mean,
really?
Well, and here's the thing,
Yes.
too. And your colleague at George Mason, one of your colleagues, I thought framed this nice in response to Chris Arnotti's book and some other things about, like you said, who is harmed the most by these sort of sentimentalist policies in academia and everywhere else, but let's focus on academia. And he just asked a simple question. I'm talking about Tyler Cohen. He just asked a simple question. Which is more condescending to the poor, to the disadvantaged? Is it more condescending to apply lower standards or to apply higher standards? Or equal standards, essentially. Is it to treat them as incapable, or is it to treat them capable and thus hold them to a standard of excellence? And I thought that's a great way to put it, because everybody's instinct is to say, well, let's give somebody, thus the adversity SAT, let's give somebody who came from a rough neighborhood a break. We're going to relax the academic standards. Let's give somebody who just had a mom at home a break, but we're going to relax the academic standards. Is that more condescending than saying, hey, boy, you want to get into this state school, then and you want to be in the engineering program, then these are the standards, and we'll try and help you meet them, perhaps, but you got to meet these standards like anybody else, and it's the same thing for the rich kids that try to buy their way in. Which is more condescending? I think that's a great way to look at it.
I always remind people how hard it used to be to graduate. If you ever saw the movie Citizen Kane, there's the great line where they talked about Citizen Kane, and he said, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Cornell, Switzerland. He was rejected. He failed all these schools. In other words, he was like a rich kid. He got into all the top schools, but he failed all of them. And, this was like, in the old days, that meant that even if you bought your way in, there was no guarantee you'd graduate.
Right, and so and this is another important point you make. I'm glad you mentioned the Citizen Kane example, because this is the other thing going on. So you get in, you can't do the work at that level, and then so you just transfer into a less rigorous major, and you get out. You may be at the bottom of the class, but you still get out with that credential, which is all you really wanted. So who does that serve? It doesn't serve the student. It doesn't serve the school. It just sort of serves the complex, right?
Mm-hmm. And to anticipate a problem that often comes up here, I'm not saying that grades are everything. So sometimes there are extracurriculars that really do make a difference. For example, I would say that but it really makes a difference at the margin. Imagine there are two kids. One kid who's from a high school who's got straight A's and he's good test scores, but he doesn't do athletics. And the other one has the same classes, the same test scores, and straight A's, and is captain of the basketball team. Well, that person clearly needs an extra boost because there is extra effort to managing a team. But to say that there's an extra benefit to being, say, a very good sports person, or to being a good manager, or a good writer, or being a good musician, in addition to being a scholar, is very different from saying we should accept athletes whose test scores are 300 or 400 points below the median of that school.
He is Professor John VC Nye, Professor of Economic History and New Institutional Economics at George Mason University. The piece at Reason.com, which I'll tweet out at Dan Proft, Make Schools Hard Again. Professor, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Take care.
Goodbye.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Hear about the big stories of the day, then talk about them right here on Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.